There we go. And I have everybody muted, I think, except for, let me do that. Okay, I think everybody's muted, Karen, except for you and Tim and myself. So take it away.
Okay. Hello, I'm Karen Berner, and on behalf of ACE, I'd like to welcome you to our May meeting, Parallelisms Between the Fall of Rome and Modern Day America. After our presentation, we will have a short ACE business meeting. I'd like to remind you to please mute yourself when not speaking, and that this discussion will be recorded and posted on our social media. Also, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat, and we'll get to them after Tim's presentation. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Historian Tim Berner is a PhD candidate in archaeology and sociolinguistics at the University of Nottingham in the UK. He has a master's degree in Roman Frontier Studies from Newcastle University and a Master of Letters in Ancient Cultures, Roman and Celtic from the University of Glasgow. I'll turn things over to you now, Tim. Thank you for being here.
Of course. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you guys for having me. I'm looking forward to this. So I thought I would just share my screen now so you can see the pretty pictures that I've got for you. So I'll do that now. And could someone just let me know that it shared successfully before I go on?
Yes, okay. Tim, we can see it.
Good. So as we have just talked about, and this presentation is talking about how there's a comparison between the Roman Empire and the modern American situation that we find ourselves in. And this fancy word here is called eschatological, which means the end of societies. So hopefully that won't come to that, but this presentation hopes to have a way to think about different ways that societies do end up falling and ways to perhaps avoid those situations. So, okay. There you go. So what I thought would be a good idea to start is kind of familiarize you all with just a map, like any good history presentation, about the Roman Empire in general. And so I chose this map partly because it shows just the expanse of it, and also that this was a period of quite a long time in which the empire actually expanded. And so starting from central Italy, it went all directions to accomplish its tasks. And so for the majority of the presentation, we'll be talking about the Roman Republic. And just for your benefit, often the history of Rome is separated into the quote unquote Republic and the quote unquote Empire. That's a historian's doing. That's not actually necessarily representative of the political machinations going on. So for the whole time period, it's always an empire, meaning that they always conquer other people. And that's actually a big part of what it means to be a Roman, is to conquer others. So with that being said, a good takeaway to think about how kind of Roman society functioned is that it's a martial society, meaning that it always is trying to be at war. And that's a big part of its ethos collectively. And so same with this map suggests, as time goes on, they are more successful in this endeavor. Politically speaking, the leaders of different, we'll say families or landed gentry ended up also being generals. And so initially what that would do is that expanded the Roman Empire. And over time, this is actually one of the reasons why the Republic fell, which we'll get to in a little bit. So I thought it would be helpful to just briefly consider how the Roman Republic actually worked. And so this governmental system was in place for, we'll say, about 300 to 400 years, depending on who you're talking to. And it's actually quite complicated, so I just thought it would be, I'll try to do the abridged version. So essentially, it's called a republic, much like the American context, because it is a representative democracy. Unlike the US, however, most people could not vote. It's quite different in that regard. So the Senate, for the majority of the Roman Republic, who were the governing body of the empire, they were often patricians, which is this little word here. And what that means essentially is landed gentry. So they're quite similar to, for example, if any of you are familiar with, Regency England or something of that nature, the landed gentry are the ones who often have quite a lot of power. And that is true for pretty much all societies all the time. And Rome was not any exception. Later down the line, this other group called the plebeians, or in English, plebeian, who are non-landed people, become part of the Senate as well. But they often kind of like the nouveau riche. So they don't have the same social status, but that doesn't mean that they don't have quite a lot of wealth. And so these things compete in the actual Senate itself. But the key being that the Senate is very much a quintessential part of the Roman Republic. And then much like how we have a president, they elected 2 councils. So if you think about it, if you kind of have, one of the reasons why the American president is the commander-in-chief is because of one of the councils being the head of, quote unquote, the head of the military, and the other one is the head of governance. Now those distinctions are sometimes blurred, but those are the general idea. And so essentially that's just how the government works, and it slightly changes over time when you get questions of citizenship and who can be part of the Senate. But as a general rule of thumb, remember that this is quite early to the US, and the concept of universal suffrage or any of that is very much not at play ever. So let's not assess the Romans with a modern kind of sensibility, because they will always fail. So sorry about all the maps, and in the future there will be quite a few maps. And so this piece here shows a little bit about the time period that we're looking at. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time now talking about the 130s BC until 40-ish BC. And that's when you see the Republic progressively fall apart. And so I thought that would be helpful to talk about. Sad, but helpful nonetheless. So, like I had talked about earlier, the Roman Empire was characterized by generals. So you have those 2 councils, right? And you have the Senate, and those 2 are often competing, and they're very much the legislative type of government. But the individuals who expanded the empire and had a tremendous amount of power were also military generals. So you can also have generals who were senators, which is often the case. But one should really focus on the generals and their own armies as they expand the empire more and more. Because unlike modern, I mean, you could say that's true for most, even modern day civilizations, but the idea of standardization or a strong central government is very much of a new phenomenon. So if you think about all of the modern amenities that we have non-existing, the importance of a singular figure or group in that military situation that has the armies to control large swaths of land obviously will have quite a sway in the government, particularly if they are also senators or councils. And so that piece of what expanded Rome and made Rome this extreme power in the Mediterranean, as this map suggests, is also the reason that, or one of the reasons why the Republic fell. So that's a note of caution. I'm not suggesting that America has the same thing, but we should be aware. So the spicy bits. So the first person who tried to fiddle with what it meant to have a republic in the Roman Empire was this guy called Sulla. And Sulla, essentially what he did was he was a very impactful general. He had a series of legions or armies under his disposal, and he was not so keen on the Senate trying to curb his power, because generally speaking, a senator could hold an army for a specific amount of time, and if they, after that, we'll say a term, they were supposed to be done. And so he was both general and also one of the councils. So he had a considerable amount of power, which he was unwilling to give up when his term was finished. And so essentially Sulla tried to invade the city of Rome, which is like the hearth, the spiritual, economic, social hub of the Roman Empire, hence obviously Roman. And within that time, he did somewhat take over the city, but he was promptly assassinated. So he was very much not successful in his endeavor. And so I start off with a little comparison to the US right now, but we have some more Roman stuff to get through before we get to the full meat of that. But I think often, at least in the last few years, people are quick to associate Trump, who is not my favorite, but Trump, with fascists or with the Romans. I don't think that's true, because first off, as much as the events of the inciting the events of the Capitol earlier this year were a complete cluster and a strange blip in American history, it was by no means a successful coup, nor did he have a military dictatorship which took over the state. So he is just a narcissist, really. And so I like to hearken him to a Sulla because it shows that perhaps Republican principles, or in our case, democratic principles, are teetering a little bit, but that doesn't mean that they are at any rate close to being ended. However, in the Roman context, this is not the case. So after Sulla, and this is about 70, 80 years afterward. So there's 70 or 80 years of an additional Republican era. And then essentially the empire keeps growing, and three individuals who control massive swaths of the Roman Empire become Triumvirate. So it's called the First Triumvirate. So Triumvirate literally means three men. And so what this was an kind of informal. No, hold up. Someone's playing a video, there, a sound, just so you know. But anyways, these three very much wealthy, well-to-do super generals. They controlled, it would be the equivalent of if we had a politician and or martial leader who controlled the whole East Coast, the whole West Coast, and the South. So pretty substantial amount of power, both martially and socially. And so this is an informal alliance, however, between these three individuals to, or at least on the surface, preserve Rome, but all the while, I doubt that that was their real motivation. And out of these three, so there's Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, or Kaiser. Fun fact, Kaiser is the same word in German, or the same word they relate each other. But I think probably the most well-known is Caesar for good reason. Or not, I guess not a good reason, but he's infamous for this. Because Caesar, so here's a little map of their land. So like I said, pretty significant area. So the red in the map is what is technically legally owned by the Republic of, or the Senate of Rome. The yellow is Caesar's lands. And then you get the other two pieces with Pompey in the east. And then Crassus had a series of lands also in the east, but also in North Africa. However, this kind of comes to a quick, not a quick end, but an end nonetheless, when our boy Caesar takes his legions that were successful in the conquest of Gaul, which is in modern day France, Western Germany, and the Pays-Bas, so Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. And so that's where that region is. And so he had a tremendous amount of wealth from this. So when Caesar invaded Gaul, he enslaved and slaughtered about 60% of the population and gained a significant amount of, we'll say, war bounties. So he had a huge wealth deposit that he previously hadn't. And rather than, as I had said with Sulla, rather than relinquishing his legions to the Senate, he did a thing called crossing the Rubicon. And so the Rubicon is kind of like the spiritual boundaries of the city of Rome. So I guess the thing that would be probably the most similar in the US is if, I don't know, like the Soviets in the Cold War decided to cross like Ellis Island or something, or so that kind of like there's this kind of socially or spiritually designated boundaries. It's called temnos in Latin, of this is what is sacred to us in our civic area, and by crossing it, which had never been done before actually, was a huge transgression of that. And so essentially, Crassus, who is the other guy in the Triumvirate, he dies. He loses pretty quickly, and then it becomes essentially a civil war between Caesar, who is, we could say, the western parts of the Roman Empire, and Pompey, who is the more eastern parts of the Roman Empire, particularly the province of Asia, which is Western Turkey, and then Egypt. And so Pompey also had a tremendous amount of money. However, Caesar is victorious, and there's a little, I put the notes on there for you, on Pharsalos, which is in Western Macedonia, so northern, just outside of Greece. And so Caesar becomes this new figure, which had previously not been established. And before I move on, I thought this might be helpful, is because the Roman Republic was such a unique kind of situation, most ancient kingdoms did not have a democratic system. So, and when I say most, I mean in the Mediterranean too. Other northern people had more of a tribal system that had more democratic principles, but very much not in this way. And so the Romans took it as very much of a spiritual side of thing, of this, we have this form of democracy that we are really keen on. And so they were ardently against anyone who they would consider to be a rex or a king. They were very much against it. And they, for example, they would throw infinite amounts of shade at Eastern empires like the Persians or others who had kings. And they just thought that was completely asinine. So this is actually a pretty massive thing to do. And honestly, it's a similar thing to the US, right? If, for example, if someone became the tyrant of America, I think we'd all be pretty unhappy like that. So anyway, Caesar's doing a pretty substantial thing. And in his power, he, much like any tyrant, tried to fundamentally change many pieces of the Roman government, and also how particularly the Italian peninsula would work. And also, for you guys to know, the word dictator is a Latin word, dictator, and so it specifically means someone who has military authority for a specific designation of time. So when a consul or any senator becomes a dictator, they're given the legions of the Senate to enact the power of the Senate. But it's on a term basis or a need basis. And so when Caesar and then subsequent emperors, as we'll see, have no desire to relinquish that, they become, there's a reason why we use now in English dictator as a martial leader who has now controlled the state, is for this specific reason. And so Caesar tried to do a lot of things, but for brevity's sake, I thought we would just include a few. One of which is this really important concept, which will come to play throughout this presentation, which is vox populi, or the voice of the people. That is very rarely in the history of humanity actually for the people. So what it tends to be is that an individual, party, or a collective will do something and say, hey, I'm the utopia, I'm going to help you through vox populi, and I have the voice of the people, I am a good leader, I will help you. And they often do not do that. And at least in the Roman case, very much the opposite. And so if you could remember that word, and you can remember it as vox populi too, but I'm going to be a little purist about it, I apologize. But that's a concept that is quite pertinent in the Roman context and through many other contexts in general. So with that said, because Caesar was such a military man, he tried to redistribute land within Italy and a few other provinces around the Italian peninsula to give to his soldiers, his veterans, as kind of a repayment, which was unheard of previously. That was not a thing that happened. And he also tried to make those people Roman citizens. And unlike the US, actually, I suppose like the US, the concept of citizenship is very specific. So it's very fluid as well. So in academic jargon, we call it polysemic, meaning that it has multiple variables happening at once. So with that said, who is a citizen and what constitutes as citizenship changes throughout the whole history of the Roman experience. In this case, he is one of the first to give citizenship as a blanket to his veterans specifically, where previously citizens were pretty much only patricians, so that landed elite class, and otherwise it wasn't often extended to most people. In reality, citizens in the Roman Republic were about 2% of the population, and I'm being generous about that. The rest were pretty much peasants, slaves. Oh, yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So it wasn't a good time for most people. But one thing that's actually quite impactful that he tried to do, and I should preface this, Caesar tried to implement these things, but he wasn't exactly successful. And he also, in order to get more power for himself, to become dictator for life, he tried to progressively remove power from the Senate, either replacing the Senate seats with loyalists from his own army, or giving imposts or taxes to them such that they were unable to support their seat, because to be a senator, you had to pay a specific fee. So it's a very much of a deliberate attempt to do so. And then finally, just as a little kind of strange thing to do, but as I said, Rome was the center of trade, society, religion, what have you. The Julia family, hence why his name is Julius Caesar, tried to change the center of trade to being Ostia, which was his own family's trade port, which didn't really go over particularly well for anybody. And just as kind of as a rule, basically the First Triumvirate, which was those three guys fighting together and then eventually at each other, you get the first glimpse of this distinction that ends up being the main distinction between what ends the Roman Republic, which is you have the candidate or the general, the vox populi, so the people's man. And I'm going to put that in quotes every single time, because historically speaking, it is very, very rare that the people's person is actually doing that. So especially in Rome. And so they have the people's man, the general, and very much interested in redistributing land for their own citizens or their own veterans. And that's quite opposite to the Pompey-like figure, who was the most patrician you could be. His family was a leader in the Senate for 400 years, which is pretty established politician, we'll say. And he was tremendously wealthy, and it's very much of a senatorial class. So one of the reasons that it's hard sometimes to map on the Roman Republic, the fall of the Roman Republic, to America is this, that both parties are not really interested in the actual people. So the one party that's actually the party, we'll say, or the people who are trying to preserve democratic process in Rome are the same party of landed gentry and patricians, versus the other party, whatever their allegiance may be, are trying to become authoritarian leaders, but are also quote unquote the party of the people, which makes it complicated in things. And just also in general, whether it's in Rome or modern day, one should always have a multivariable analysis of something, meaning that there's very rarely an instance in which one thing's true universally for everything else. So there's often many reasons as to why people would do something or why things happen, And studying Rome or the history of the Roman Empire or Republic is very much in that same vein. So my favorite day, because I don't particularly care for Caesar. So I'm biased. So I study Gaul. That's my specialty. And so it's not exactly sad to me that Caesar was murdered. So in the Ides of March, which is a beautiful day that everyone should celebrate, it's the 15th. Cheers. His senators, who were again patricians, they were not so keen on his tremendous reorganization of the republic for his own needs. And so en masse, they killed him in the Senate floor. And that's why there's that famous quote, "Et tu, Brute," which is actually not from the Romans at all. It's literally not Latin. It's not correct, grammatically correct Latin. It's from what's his face? From Shakespeare, actually. So Shakespeare has a lot of impacts in a lot of ways, but his Latin is not the best. But at any rate, this event, you could say, stalled the second attempt in the Roman Republic to become something other than it was. But that doesn't mean the attempt stopped. So I just thought I would write this out for you. I'm just going to take a glass of water quick. So, and just one more final point too about Latin phrases. So in English, we often hear this bread and games or bread and circuses type politicians. This comes from Caesar, specifically Julius Caesar, and then subsequent emperors. And that goes back into that theme of vox populi, right? So if you give all this food all of a sudden to these banquets, and you give citizenship to certain groups, and you help out the people, all the while you're actually completely changing the government to benefit you, is a complicated scenario. And so that really characterizes Caesar and the second attempt on behalf of a Roman to undo the republican system. So, and of course, there's a second one. So this is just a bit later, and the most famous of these three. So there's Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. And Octavian on the left is better known as Augustus, but his actual name is Octavian, and he is the grandson of Julius Caesar. Mark Antony is just another patrician, very similar to Pompey. So he had the same land areas of what is today Turkey and then Egypt, and was very keen on having a strong Senate and having the Senate control Roman territories. Octavian less so. And this guy Lepidus, he kind of just doing his own thing. He had the province of Africa, which is what is today Tunisia, and then a little bit of Libya. He kind of was an isolationist. So the main difference, as you can imagine, the outcome of this is going to be pretty similar to the previous one, when three super wealthy generals who control most of the empire, who want power for themselves, they tend to fight. This would be true for this. But the difference between the first triumvirate and the second one is that the second one was actually legally in place. So after Caesar was assassinated, it continued this kind of period, which lasted for about 100 years, of a civil war type environment, of extreme divisiveness along tribal, territorial, any kind of lines you possibly could think of, really. And so to try and curb that, the Senate decided to legislate this second triumvirate of three powerful individuals that hopefully they thought would stabilize this scenario. It of course didn't, because that never does, but alas. So here's another map. And like I said, the lands essentially map onto the same as the previous triumvirate. So we get Octavian with the western part of the Roman Empire. We get our boy Lepidus. He's just living his life, he's just trying, in North Africa. And then we'll say Asia, and just the Eastern Roman Empire in general under Consensual. And also, just before I move on, as a fun little, we'll say like trivia thing for those who like trivia. If you notice on the map, there's Asia, and there's Africa. So those are two Roman provinces. And of course, we use those words to mean different things. And so essentially, for example, in Asia, Asia started off as just part of Western Turkey, and then it got a little bigger, and it got even more bigger, more bigger, good English. But, and so as the kind of vernacular and understanding of the world became more expansive for the Roman Empire, the concept of Asia expanded more and more eastward, such that now we use it in English to encapsulate an entire continent. Same with Africa. It was actually quite a small province, and then progressively, as the rest of even sub-Saharan Africa got better understood by Romans, that word was used to describe a much larger landmass, and then eventually now in English, we use it to describe the continent. So it's a fun little fact. So, of course, the second triumvirate goes poorly pretty quickly. And Lepidus, the guy, he tries to establish his own little state in North Africa, and he is quickly killed. And then it becomes a conflict between East and West, essentially. Western Roman Empire versus Eastern Roman Empire, between Octavian and Mark Antony. And this battle of Actium, which is over here in Greece. And it's called a Pyrrhic victory, meaning that both sides get real mucked up, but one technically wins. And so Octavian becomes then the victor. And like I had said, for both of the triumvirates, essentially you get this conflict between the people's person, the quote unquote people's person, who is a military dictator who's interested in wealth distribution to his own group, versus the kind of old guard, often very much landed elites who advocate for democracy and the continuation of the Republican system. However, in both triumvirates, we could say that the Vox Populi candidate wins. So I put a little lesson here, but I think in general, regardless of what side of the aisle they lie on, whether it's left or right, those who claim to be utopian fixers or those who claim to have good intentions in every way often do not. And so now we get to basically Augustus, who is the end of the Republic. So, as you may have noticed, he changes his name. So his name is Octavian, or Octavianus, and he changes it to Augustus. And Augustus literally means like blessed, like blessed guy. So it's the Roman equivalent of #blessed, which is of course not cringy. And he becomes this figure. It's also, he chooses this word because aug, the AUG, also has a reference to augury, which is the spiritual study of birds. And the Romans take that extremely seriously. And so his name also implies that he is, in fact, you could say, beloved by the gods. So there's a double, in the Latin language, there's a double meaning there. So Augustus, when he is successful, he ends up trying to do and succeeding in the same kind of reforms that his grandfather Caesar had attempted, but he goes real hard. And so one of the things that he does that's quite important is these titles. So like I had mentioned, the Romans were quite keen on making sure that they had a distinction between themselves as Republic people versus these, Eastern kings and all these other kind of styles of governance that they thought were bad. So in this case, he insisted on being called Princeps Civitatis, which means the first citizen, the chief citizen, as in like the best guy. And in fact, if you referred to him as anything else, he would literally kill you. So he's actually quite insistent on that, because all the while he was presenting himself as just the first citizen, helping Rome get back its order after this long period of chaos, was being beneficial to everyone and being helpful to the whole Roman Empire. He was also becoming Pontifex Maximus, which is on the right side with his little robe. It's a specific kind of toga that is for religious observation. And it is also the same word for the Pope in Catholicism, the Pontifex Maximus. So what that means is it's the head of the Roman state religion. So he becomes dictator for life, the first citizen, which he then becomes both of the councils. So he's the military council and also the legislative council. And he holds this title called, well, he holds the title of imperator, but meaning he has imperium. And so that's where we get the word emperor from. But it's a specific concept of expansiveness of power. So I titled part of this presentation Imperia Sine Fine, which means imperium or the expansion of power without end. It's kind of a similar concept. Actually, no, it's a much more intense version of Manifest Destiny that the American West had. But think of it on steroids. So they mean, when they say that there's without end of the Roman glory and power, they mean it. And so him taking up this concept and title is both religious, social, and economic. So what I'm saying is that Augustus, while insisting that he was a man of the people, he had vox populi, and was quite insistent on not being perceived as a dictator, an emperor, whatever authoritative or authoritarian governor, he by all means was. He controlled every element of the state, socially and economically, which is intense. And then you get on the left side, it's called the Prima Porta Augustae. It's a cool statue, actually. It's just like right outside the Forum in Rome. And you still have one. But, and this should actually be purple because the Romans dyed their statues. So they're much more in your face. But this is his toga of war. It's called the toga virilis. So it's specifically the toga that boys get after being successful in war. And his little armor here, it's hard to see, but basically he's retrieving a variety of military implements from conquered Persians. So he's got this military thing, but he's also got the I'm a devout, pious man, and I will help you. Sure. But in terms of his reforms, much like I had mentioned with Caesar, Augustus was quite successful in his redistribution of land. And it was completely controlled by the state, which is new. Never in the history of the Roman Republic or in the history of anywhere in Europe, actually, up until this point, had any leader had the state control land and its distribution. So it's a pretty significant change. And in so doing, a lot of his new citizens that were loyal to him, that he made citizens, as well as those who were in his armies, that veterans who then were given this new land, were given land in places like Gaul, in Ilidia, which is like Croatia, modern day Croatia, so in the Adriatic, and then in South Italy, against this group called the Samnites, who are not actually Latin speakers. They had their own culture. And so he exterminated those areas or enslaved them, and then gave this land to the new loyalist type figures. So as I said, best be wary of these kind of people. But this is a horrible thing, but it's a fun fact. So in doing this and in forcing this state-run system that had previously not been in place, it's estimated, and scholars go back and forth about this, but it's basically for the most of the Republic, slavery would compose about 15 to 20% of the workforce. During the 43 years of Augustus's reign, it increased to 60 to 65% of the workforce, which is a significant jump. Also, slavery and prostitution are the longest lasting human institutions. Every single society has had slavery, every single one of them. And the Romans were just quite good at it. And slaves tended to be from Gaul, so like I said, modern day France, the Balkans in general, and specifically from a place called Dacia, which is modern day Romania. So it was a huge enterprise that Augustus really spearheaded as part of his land redistribution reforms. Secondly, you have, I said babies galore, it's just kind of be funny, but essentially one of the reasons why the Romans are hard to map onto modern day political movements or ideologies is for this. So he also was kind of a traditionalist, and he thought that if you force, not force, but really, I'm gonna say force, legally mandate that people get married and they have kids to have a new baby boom after these series of wars, he legislated that. And if you had a baby out of wedlock, there was severe penalties, which often led to slavery. So he was quite contingent on making sure that everything was legally collected with the state. And then finally, there's this phrase that I'm sure many of you have heard before, which is Pax Romana, which means Roman peace. And there's also one during the British Empire of Pax Britannica. And what that means is a period of stability, economic growth, and infrastructure development because of long-standing empires. And so Augustus started this kind of project and continued it after his grandkids and subsequent emperors tried to continue this. But Augustus was quite keen on making himself be the man that started all of this beautiful change that was benefiting all people. And so he commemorated these things in the Areopagus, which is literally the altar of peace, of Augustan peace. And it's actually a really cool monument. It's it looks like I don't know, like a little box. But on the whole, it's an actual altar. So inside you could do sacrifices, and then around the whole inside and then the outside are pictorial representations of the history of the Roman people. And they all culminate both mythically and just historically to Augustus being the dude who's doing this. And same thing, he wrote this massive, or not he didn't write, but he had written this massive proclamation called the Res Gestae, which it literally means my deeds, my things, my great deeds. And so they proclaim all of the amazing things that he's doing for the people. And on one hand, you could say that's true, but on the other hand, you best remember that, the massive influx in slavery and complete genocide is another piece of Augustus's reign. So he's a complicated figure. So I like to consider if we're thinking about how does this kind of map onto a more modern framework. And what I mean by modern, I mean 1800s and on, because I study ancient stuff. So you guys gotta, just throw me a bone with this. It's very new. 1820 is very new. And so I like to think of if we decided to say, okay, how do the Romans kind of map onto modern day frameworks, and specifically Augustus? How does he actually look in a modern kind of framework? And I like to call him a lowercase c communist and a capital F fascist. And I'll explain that. So first premise is that I think often when we think about modern nation state style political ideations or the political spectrum, we think of it as a line. I don't really think that's a good idea. I think we should think of it more as like a circle. Because the reality is that both communism and fascism, they are essentially on the same branch. The ideological position that encourages them to come to power or come to play tend to be slightly different, but how they actually manifest and are implemented end up being quite similar. And so I referred to Augustus in this way because I think he encapsulates kind of both pieces of these quite dangerous philosophies. And I'm going to explain both of them in a second. I just wanted to introduce this to you. And also, just as another little barroom fun fact. So fascism is from this specific item. It's called fasces, and the fasces, hence, so fasces, fascism. They are the reeds that encapsulate the acts of the imperial guards of the Roman Empire. So there's very much of a link between what we consider to be fascists and Augustus specifically, but also then later Roman emperors. So it's a fun fact, a sad fact, but a fun one. And before I get to modern parallels, I thought I would just briefly mention kind of the social end of things, particularly that of the end of the Roman Empire. So the end of the Republic is, you could say, 40s, 30s BC. And the end of their empire, depending on who you talk to, could range anywhere between the 300 to 400s, more so the 400s AD, all the way till 1456, which is when Constantinople, or modern day Istanbul, which is the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, was conquered by the Ottoman Empire. For the sake of this, let's just say 400s. But essentially what I think is really quite interesting in how a lot of societies fall is that they often switch, or they really go into a different path of what their original kind of general ethos or morals fabric were like. And so obviously the Roman ethos or value system is quite different than ours. But they're very much, for the majority of the Roman Empire, like I had mentioned earlier, they were quite intense on martiality, of being warriors, of conquering. They're also Stoics. Stoicism, if you want me to clarify that more, I can, and if you have questions about it, I can later. But anyways, the Stoicism is a very big part of what it means to be a Roman. And also hard work, essentially, like labor is the Latin word for a reason, and they are quite contingent upon it. However, at the end of the empire, this is very much not the case. There's quite a lot of distant rulers that have nothing to do with any of the governing. They're known specifically that I chose these words, so opulence, idleness, and pacifism, because they're titles that Romans give other Romans during this period. And so it actually really bothers a big portion of Romans that their leadership and their generals are doing this. And also, as a strange but related fact, the kind of sexual mores went wild. So the Romans always had like a unique view on this, but it went quite intensely. And like I had mentioned there, specifically in the city of Rome, the province of Africa, and the Greek-speaking world, sexual mores were quite bizarre. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why Christianity actually had a large success in this period of time, because it offered an antidote to these very loose style of ethics within the Roman context. And then finally, probably one of the larger pieces of why the Roman Empire actually ended up falling apart was because of this tension between migration and also citizenship. So much like I had said that citizenship is polysemic and it fluctuates quite often, the later Roman emperors tried to give citizenship to larger groups of people, and that messed with the kind of fabric of how the Roman system actually worked. It also messed with the concept of slavery, because if you can't be a slave if you're a citizen. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that was a good call, like we should have slavery, but I'm just saying that it actually did economically mess up how the system was working. And in this period, because of people like the Huns, for example, groups like the Huns, who were steppe people who came in and just colossally mucked up huge swaths of Europe, that a lot of people who are living in what is today, for example, Poland or Germany, could not sustain what they were previously doing. And consequently, they migrated into various pieces of the Roman Empire. Sometimes it was peaceful, sometimes it wasn't. And it ends up in this quite of a cluster of rebellions, invasions, and this is one of the reasons why the empire actually falls apart. So now we're going to go to light subjects like fascism. Okay, so I thought I would just describe this in brief to you. Just as a refresher, I'm sure you guys are fairly familiar with fascism. I think it's probably the most thrown around phrase, at least in the last 5 years. And so I would define fascism as it says here. It's contingent upon a martial dictator or a party who has a martial dictatorship collective, who is extremely authoritarian, ultra nationalistic, and rules without any level of mercy. So on the right, we've got a pretty famous photo of Mussolini, who's on the far end, and then Hitler. And one thing that I think is important actually to think about when we think about fascists is, much as like I had said that communists and fascists kind of are in the same branch, is about the actual Nazi party. So the Nazis were called the National Socialist Party for a reason. They originally were by no means what we consider to be Nazis. When we think of Nazi, we think of like, oh boy, justifiably so. But the Nazi party came out of World War I and the economic cluster that it caused in Germany, and they were a labor party. So they were interested in unionizing, in expanding the state to have a large scale protections for its people. And they were actually quite similar to a lot of the talking points that the Labour Party, for example, in Britain has. Again, I'm not suggesting that the Labour Party in Britain are Nazis, but it's important to know how the party actually develops. However, eventually this guy Hitler, who was a young up-and-coming piece of this puzzle, he became friends with Mussolini, who Mussolini had always been a fascist. So the Italians, in the attempt to revitalize, I guess you could say, the power of Rome, tried to revitalize fascism, which is where it's from, the Romans. So Hitler got quite enthralled with this style of governance, and then progressively with his influence, the Nazi party went from being socialist, quickly turning into this weird hybrid of fascist socialists to becoming, just before World War II, the hardcore fascist ultra-right kind of authoritarians that we associate with them. But it's a cluster of a story. And then the picture on the left, I chose that because the imagery is very specific. So the reason that they're holding this style of lectors is because it's a Roman thing. There's a reason there's an eagle on top, and there's a reason why the Nazis call themselves the Third Reich, because Reich means Rome. And they're referring to the second Rome was the Holy Roman Empire, and then now the Nazi party was the new Rome and the new expansion of this kind of auctoritas or authoritarianism. So that's fascism. Now we get to communism. So communism, I would argue, it has a very similar end result to fascism. So like I said here, assuming that this is well-intentioned, I think often communism is perceived as being particularly well-intentioned. That may or may not be true. But essentially, Marx and Engels, who are German philosophers, economists in some level, wrote this book, hence the Communist Manifesto, in which they argued that in order to change the society where they saw fit, that there should be a powerful revolutionary change led by the proletariat, who are the working class, to overthrow the bourgeoisie, which is the nouveau riche, you could say. So you can call them capitalists, you could call them just the upper middle class, and it's from a French term, specifically of this kind of lounging class who worked and also lounged, and they had the finances to do that in order to create what Marx and Engels termed as an equal society. So on this little photo, got Marx, beard man, and his boy Engels. So they rock the mid 19th century beards. You got to do that if you're a philosopher, you know. And then we got Lenin, who was the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Stalin, who's just grim, and then Mao Zedong, who is more grim. So the thing is, much like fascism, communism doesn't end particularly well. So I thought I would include this for you as a kind of framework, because I often find that we don't talk about communism. We talk about how evil the Nazis were, and we should, and we talk about how evil fascism as a concept is, and the far right can lead to this kind of fascist state, and it most certainly can, and it shouldn't. But the far left leads to this, which is communism, which actually killed tremendously more people than any fascist state. To put it in perspective, the Holocaust killed about 6 million people, which is awful. But this is significant. And I can answer more questions about this if you'd like, but I think that's something to consider. And in regards to this, one thing that I'd like to point out is how these come to be. So much like fascism, it's pretty clear. So they often come out of economic distress and social upheaval and things of this nature. And then they rise promising this utopian state and the power of the old ways and whatever that's seen fit. And then they kill everyone who disagrees with them. The communists do it a little differently, and it depends. So the most well-known communist state is probably the Soviet Union, who, by the way, if you translate it, it means the people's collective of the Soviet Union. And that's important, that rhetorical phrase, because it's similar to Vox Populi, if you recall, right? We are the party of the people, we are the government of the people. Are you? And the Bolsheviks, in an attempt to overthrow the Tsars, so the kings of the Russian Empire, they did so, and then they led to quickly being taken over by Stalin, who was a party member, who then killed an inordinate amount of people, and had gulags in a cluster. And then we have Mao, and I use examples for, you have the fighting against the king type environment, and then they rise from that way, or you have the Mao scenario, which is in China. The communist revolution in China happened because of students. Students in universities started to think this was a good idea, and they really valued it, and they pushed really hard. Mao came to power, and then quickly the first people that were exterminated in his Cultural Revolution were students and artists and thinkers. And then massive poverty led to about 30 million people in China died because of this new redistribution of land style system. So on those happy joy notes, I bring this up because I call the Romans, specifically Augustus, a communist fascist for this reason. He kind of has both elements at play: a strong military dictatorship style, who was very much willing to murder anyone, but at the same time, socially and also economically interested in state-run command economies who controlled what you could and could not do. Because Augustus was the master of propaganda, and if you disagree with his propaganda, you would be gone. Much like how communist states, if you disagree with them, you just don't exist anymore. I do have to say though, the communist propaganda kind of art style is pretty cool. Like that mid 1900s kind of Art Deco style. They know what's up. So now I'm going to offer some positions to you, which I know that will likely upset some of you. And I ask that you just hear me out a little bit. And before I start though, I know this photo is alarming, so I'm not in any way suggesting that Biden is Augustus, a communist or a fascist, okay? What I'm suggesting is that we should be wary of certain styles of rhetoric and also certain styles of attempted in governance. So with this theme again of Vox Populi, as in that the government is us and the government controls us. It's the same sentiment that the communists use all the time. There's a reason why it's called the Democratic Republic of China, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the collective of the Soviet Union. There's a reason why fascists often call themselves the kind of people's will, or some kind of strange like fisticuff style of communicating that same information. And there's a reason why Augustus was saying, I am the people, we are collectively together. And so the reason I bring this up is I think when you have leaders who, in this case, are controlling huge swaths of governmental power, and they start having this kind of rhetoric of we are the people is us, we should be worried of that, because it is very frequently not panned out particularly well. Because utopian style governments are always authoritarian. So in Greek, where the word utopia comes from, the word dystopia doesn't exist in Greek. Utopia is both, because it's very obvious that if you try to get to a utopian state, the amount of death and destruction that will happen is not, in fact, utopia. And this is the problem with things like communism or fascism. And I bring this up now in terms of our context is because, as you guys know, the last year and a half has been quite a quagmire, you know? Like, it hasn't been a really good time. And it's in these situations that we should watch our leaders very closely. Because in economic turmoil and social turmoil, which obviously we're in super division and plagues, COVID, we should really watch out for those who come in and say that they are the person that can fix it, only them. And the reason I bring this up in this particular case is the particular party in power at the moment is proposing the most extensive spending that the government has ever done, and interested in expanding what we mean by healthcare, what we mean by education, what we mean by voting, all the while changing and expanding the federal government. Now, that could be positive, that could be not. Personally, I think there's various elements that could be quite good and quite positive for our country, particularly in this time period. However, the historian in me, and I hope you have seen this kind of progression throughout the different periods we've talked about, it is an alarming position to have. And I'm not just critiquing the left. I think if the right was in power right now, and they would probably do the same thing, I would be more than happy to critique them as well. Because, like, let's not kid ourselves. If Trump, you know, had his third term run or something that he wanted to, he surely would have a similar, likely a similar Augustus style governance. But he is not in power. So that's that. So that's one way to think about this as a parallel with Americanism, that we should be quite worried of this kind of style or precedence. So a second comes down to more of the social piece. And like I had mentioned about Augustus being the man of propaganda, so he is actually one of the forefathers of propaganda. Like specifically in Europe, there used to be in universities. So universities started in about the 1200s, and there was whole styles of rhetoric that you could take within a university setting that taught Augustinian style propagated techniques. So Augustus style propaganda has been used in Europe for quite a long time, about 600-700 years. So with that said, the reason I think there's a similarity between this has to do with actually universities. And of course, I thought I would talk about universities because I have been in many of them, and that's what I do. I'm an academic. And I think before I move on, though, I'm not, again, suggesting, much like I wasn't suggesting for Biden, I do not think that these projects by themselves or individuals who may or may not be well-intentioned are the same thing as Mao Zedong or Caesar. Like I said, with Trump, I think we're a good 70 years out, hopefully, but it's still something to be concerned about. So the reason I bring these up, and I'll explain what these are, is about propaganda. So in the university environment, at least what I think should happen and what has historically been true in universities is that they are liberal, capital L, meaning free, in the sense that they have freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of entertaining different perspectives, understanding them, having rhetoric and discourse and learning, and then you can make up your own opinion from there. And that's something that's actually extremely important, particularly amongst universities. And I find that is increasingly less at this particular juncture in time. And that is something to be particularly worried about. So I see it less in different ways. So I'm going to explain this. So I included some images here from How to Be an Anti-Racist and the 1619 Project as kind of examples, and I can explain this more if you guys have questions. But there's a certain style of worldview, which is an ideological position. Okay, and it's under the branch of what is called postmodernism. And so what that means is it originated from French academics, like people like Derrida, Foucault, in the 60s and early 70s, and then kind of transferred into encapsulating a variety of different alternative theories. So such as queer theories, for example, in the US, quite a lot of feminist theories, critical race theories, for example, and general frameworks about what we would consider to be more identitarian, so certain groups-based ideological frameworks. And all of them are under the same kind of intellectual bubble of Marxism, meaning that in order to change the current situation that we're in, we need to overthrow what we currently have and replace it with a new order. The images that I have here propose just that. So in the case, and in both of these cases, they have the presupposition that America fundamentally is a white supremacist, patriarchal, cis sexist entity or institution. And you may or may not agree with that. And I'm not going to debate, and you can believe whatever you want. But the point is that that is not a fact. That is a position. Just like if you interpreted the world as saying, hey, I think, no, I don't, Tim doesn't, but someone could say, oh, I think that we should look at the world through the eyes of Genesis, or the lens of Genesis in the Bible. And this is how we should interpret the world. They may do so, but that is not a fact. And I think the problem when I talk about propaganda is that in university setting, which should be a conversation and looking at a variety of different positions, even if you disagree, and even Harvard here is veritas, right? Which is truth. Meaning the importance of rational discourse and facts and looking at data. If you believe in this ideological position, much like how Kennedy has suggested, and there's another similar scholar, writer, who called Robin DiAngelo, who wrote this book called White Fragility. And in both of their cases, they argue that things like rational discourse, free speech, and rhetoric with facts, using substantive arguments, are actually a product of white supremacy. And so we shouldn't do them. Now, from my point of view, I think that that is wild, particularly in a university setting, to suggest that we should just do away with this concept. And for me, it reads very similarly to when the church in the 1300s said, believe what I say, I am the way, and this is true. And I think we've done a really good job in the Western world to make sure that we don't follow that way. And it's something to be wary of. And as a final point of this, I think what was quite striking to me, because I have this experience quite often about, it seems that people are taught what to think, not how to think. So if someone just kind of rattles off the same talking points to you, that doesn't actually imply that they know the data set or the specific context that they're talking about, because every context is different. So we actually have to have specific options. Is that there's this guy called Haidt. He, at the time he worked at Berkeley, and he's a pretty famous sociologist. And what he did was he tracked or tried to find out the kind of political ideations of professors from about 75 schools in the US, so 75 universities. And starting from the 50s all the way till 2014, which is a pretty good swath of time. And what he found that was in the 50s, it was more or less 50-50 between more left-leaning, more right-leaning. As of 2014, and I imagine it is a bit more now, 93% of faculty were left-leaning, which is insane. So whether or not someone agrees with the left or appreciates or values more left style governance, it is quite worrisome that our largest and most advanced institutions have one position that is uniform, that they are telling people to think, regardless if we agree or not. And a counterexample is, because I know this is, I personally am quite more on the left side of things often. I'm kind of a centrist, but even so, if you had, for example, people like QAnon or evangelical Christians saying, this is, who occupied 93% of the university environment and said, you need to interpret it this way, that is a scary prospect either way. And so much like I suggested for any political party who is in power, or any politician, or any kind of style of propagative information distribution, we should be quite worried of that, because it often associates with political parties. And much like in the Roman context, those who are not deemed on the same path, it doesn't usually go particularly well. And it's quite worrisome in which a university is the place that this kind of singularity of thought is being produced, when in fact it should be a plurality of viewpoints, regardless if one as an individual agrees or not. So yeah, and then my final little comparenda, and again, as I know, these are super happy and light, so I apologize, is the social elements. And I like to have this an analogous to the fall of the Roman Empire, not necessarily to the fall of the Republic. And so, like I had mentioned previously, what often happens in societies, whether it's with Rome, as we discussed, or even pretty much most societies, is that the original values of the society are inverted. And I know that's kind of like a mold point. So, and I don't mean that like in the American context, I'm not suggesting that, the American values are in fact, gun-toting Texans who fly eagles and shoot guns. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. But in this context, what we get in America is an inversion of values in two different ways. At some level, America was founded on a Judeo-Christian kind of principles. Now, me personally, that's not really my cup of tea, but it is quite telling when those principles are reversed. And so I have put out two different things here, and I'll explain. And one of the ways that societies tend to go poorly is I wouldn't even say hypersexualization, like super hypersexualization. And what I mean, like in the Roman context, is you had all those kind of wild parties, and the sexual mores were quite disturbing, actually. I'm not going to really get into that because they're like really not for kids, but it was pretty strange. And now, for better or for worse, I think you could argue that this is a positive or negative thing, but hypersexualization is very much the name of the game, at least for young people. For example, I'm not sure if you're familiar with TikTok. If you're not, I hope you're not, because it's quite the platform. But who knows, you can make a little ace dances or something. But TikTok is a social media platform that has small videos. They're often 5 to 10 seconds. And it is often monopolized by kids, right? So often pre-adolescent and adolescents who have, for the most part, very, very, very sexually suggestive content. And that could be damaging because they are in fact kids. Likewise, on the bottom here, there's this place called OnlyFans. OnlyFans is a internet site. It's a service provider site, you could say. And it's originally, the premise of it was that as an individual, you could advertise yourself, you could send videos of yourself, photos of yourself, whatever, and interact with your clients. And much like most things, it turned pretty quickly into more of like a pornographic type site, in which you can pay a service or a fee to see images or videos of an individual. The thing that I think, I don't really care about that. I personally, it's you do you. It's not really my business. But in terms of a large kind of macro looking at the society, It is an inversion often of kind of Judeo-Christian values of things like modesty and chastity, or chastity. Particularly because OnlyFans is the #1 employer for women between the age of 18 and 24, which is something that may be alarming because it's a complicated scenario. Yeah, and then finally on the top right is this is a scene from this music video, or music called WAP, which I'm not going to explain to you, but it's a very sexually suggestive song, and particularly what the lyrics are talking about is aggressive sexual scenarios, female-led date rape, and bodily anatomy. That's basically that. Yeah, and it's super sexualized. And actually, on the Grammys recently, these two, which is on the left, Cardi B, and on the right, Megan Thee Stallion, they both enacted kind of like a lesbian sex scene for the Grammys, which is primarily viewed by children. And the song WAP was nominated as the most empowering song for women of 2020. And so one could argue that on one hand, that may be good, it might be empowering, on the other, perhaps not. And it's not really the point whether or not as an individual you may or may not see something as empowering. It's that actually this hypersexualization is very much an inversion of previous values that have been held for a variety of for a long period of American history. And then finally, going back to what I was talking about, the university, and kind of an inversion of American values. And I thought of kind of what does it mean to have American values? Because I often find that the right side of the aisle tries to monopolize what it means to be an American. I think that's foolish. However, I do think that there are some things that make America kind of unique. One of which is liberalism. And I don't mean being on the left. I mean, we'll say the freedom to be you and me, as some members may know. Live and let live, that style. That is very much an American style living point or viewpoint. And I think it's being adapted in a poor way. And then free speech, again. Free speech is one of the most unique phenomena that has ever happened in the history of time. I don't think modern people recognize how few societies have that. They kind of, particularly young people in America, they take it for granted. But the reality is that free speech and the way we have it has only been existing for maybe 60 years. That is very something special, and we should keep that, regardless if you agree with someone or not. Much like how every single society had slavery, and then some societies got rid of it and actually made it legally impossible, which is an amazing thing to do. Free speech is actually quite important in the long span of history. And I put here consensual capitalism, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So I think it's often considered that capitalism, by definition, is it exploits people. And it may to some level, but it doesn't exploit people any more than any other system. And I think people forget that the reality is capitalism is the first and only system of any economics ever that actually has a consensual relationship between worker and employer. And that is something that is amazingly specific to the system, because for the rest of human history, you were either a slave, a serf, or a peasant, and you didn't really have a choice. And so this kind of style of economics and governance is quite important. Plus, even in the last 40 years, the economic growth in capitalist countries in the world has taken poverty to about less than 10% of the world population, which is amazing. And that would never have happened without it. So are there problems with it? Absolutely. Just like free speech. Some people are assholes. Like that's a problem. But the reality is that it's important to preserve it. However, going back to what I was talking about universities, when ideologues fundamentally think that these pieces are actually evil and should be done away with, that's an inversion of values. And like I said, whether or not you can say that they should be done away with, or you think that they don't, that's not the point. The point is that collectively, when the original values of the society are getting changed to be formed in some kind of new order, that's when you get into some dicey territory about how does a society actually function, or will it continue to function? Yep. And so, that is essentially what I wanted to talk to you about in that really positive and happy, uplifting way. But I have a little clip for you for a second. But ultimately, you can read what I wrote here. But I think we just need to not fall into this kind of divisive trap of, if you're not with me, you're against me type stuff. And the reality is that people are more complex than that. And actually, particularly in times of crisis or a series of crises, we need to be better about communicating to our peers. Because if we don't, whether it's on the left, on the right, or the reincarnation of Caesar, people who have very much do not have the good intentions at the heart of the people will come to power. And that's something that is universally true and should be avoided. So now I have a video.
We can't hear it, Tim.
You can't hear it? Oh, well, okay. That's fine. Well, I can just tell you what it says. So basically what it says is that, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Star Wars. If you're not, you should be. So basically there's a Republic, right? And it goes completely cluster. And this guy in the middle, who is the ugly guy, the Emperor, he plays both sides. And then in order to have liberty, unity, and not liberty, excuse me, to have safety, order, and a utopian kind of system, they reorganize themselves, or are reorganized as an empire. And I thought that was pretty telling to the Roman context, but also perhaps, or hopefully not, but maybe to ours down in the future. And the chilling part of it, I suppose, is one of the senators, who is Padme Amidala, who's awesome, but she is quite influential in the Senate as being the kind of like, hey, let's not do that. And so she just says, as everyone applauds, so this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause. And that is often the case in pretty much every single empire that has ever happened. So yeah, and with that, my friends, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Excellent.
Thanks so much, Tim.
Yeah, well, thanks for listening.
I wanted to throw it out to see if anybody has any questions before we move on to the business meeting section. If you do, either raise your hand on Zoom or type it in the chat.
Hey, Tim, just real quick, because, you kind of talked a little about Rome and how it fell, and then, obviously concerns in history. But I was just curious because, you can still go to Italy, right? And there's still people, but when we say it fell, what happened over the next few hundred years after that? What happened with Rome?
So much like with most things, when academics or whomever, they say that something fell, like it's not like it just yeets into the sea, like it does still exist. But in terms of Roman context, basically the empire gets divided into small warring states. So think of it in a American context, it would be, let's say America kind of fell apart. Ideally not, but who knows? For example, it was, let's be honest, so Boston would be itself. So it'd be Boston versus other parts of the Northeast versus like weird parts of the South versus like Texas by itself. All these kind of small kingdoms that would go to war with each other constantly. And so one of the reasons why historians refer to this, the period of, we'll say 500-ish AD, so all the way until maybe the 1200s, is as the Dark Ages, is because two reasons. Partly because of the church trying to say, hey, you will read nothing and learn nothing, but also because ironically, the stability that was possible through the Roman Empire completely disintegrated, and it just was a series of wars over petty things for a huge amount of time. So that's tends to what happen when empires fall apart, or with big systems fall apart, is they just become city-states, warring city-states, it becomes basically tribalism like previous times.
Thanks, Tim. No, I was just curious.
Mhm.
So the liberties that you used to have, they all kind of disappear. You end up in a warring state. Okay.
Okay, anyone else? Questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, Tim. This
Yeah,
has been
thanks
a
for having me.
really enlightening discussion and presentation. We really appreciate it. So now on to our business meeting.
Oh, hold up. There's a.
Good?
Mhm.
Okay. And as I'm sure you are all well aware, it's been a newsworthy week in Washington with the ouster of Liz Cheney and comments beginning in the Senate for the People Act. To give us an update on legislation, here are Beverly George and Janice Podolsky. Bev, why don't you start, please? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Janice and I have divided things up, and so I'm going to share my screen with you too. Give me just a moment. Hold on. Let me go back. I'm sorry. I had it where I could grab it and now I don't. So get this up first. All right, here we go. PowerPoint. There we go. And now I have to go back and do this. So. All right, can you start to see what I have here? Hold on, let me slide it over and play it. Okay, can you see that now?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the American Jobs Plan, with a postscript on the filibuster, because right now there have been a lot of really large bills presented, and they have some very excellent points, but in the end, will they pass is the critical question. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, oops, sorry, I keep doing that. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act was passed by the previous 116th Congress in the House, but rejected in the Senate. And it still has to be proposed and passed with this 117th Congress. The target date to pass it in this one article I read was June 30th. So they have a lot of work to go. Election 2020 data by race, age, and sex shows some potential and interesting problems for the GOP. And this again is based on data and interpretation of data as well. So I'm saying that in light of what Tim was talking about. All right, so the electorate, us, the voters, was more diverse in racially than ever before. It was 72% white, which is down 2% from 2016 and down 5% from 2008. 39% of Biden-Harris voters were people of color, while 15% of the Trump-Pence voters were people of color. 61% of Biden-Harris voters were white. The biggest turnout gains were from young voters. So we saw a big increase in young voters, which is defined in this study as 18 to 40-year-olds. and let me see if I can move this because I'm having a hard time reading my own slide, who make up, I forgot, 39% of voters, I believe it is. Younger voters do skew toward the Democrats in values and positions. Voters over 55 years old have dropped to 44%. So while they're still significant, they keep dropping, and that we expect because the boomers are aging and will eventually die off. And so older voters will be replaced with younger voters as a percent of the population. Women break toward Democrats by a 10-point gap overall. 39% of women of color support Democrats, 58% of white women voted for Biden-Harris, and women make up 54% of the electorate overall. That's from the 2020 election. Now, history for John Lewis's Voting Rights Act. I'm going to be really quick and just read through this. The 15th Amendment was passed February 3rd, 1870, and it guaranteed the right to vote to eligible former male slaves. Women were not voting, obviously, but there were no legislative teeth to enforce the 15th Amendment at that time. And Reconstruction, if you define it as the 10-year period following the Civil War, during which Union troops were posted in the southern states, and then they were removed after about 10 years. As soon as they were removed, the Jim Crow laws were passed quickly in the former Confederate states. And then later on, the Jim Crow laws were tightened again following World War I and again after World War II, when Black American soldiers returned from the war thinking that their position in society and in the economy would be bettered and people would appreciate their having fought for this country. That did not happen in the Southeast. We know the stories about more and more monuments put up and more people voted in to make even sometimes more restrictive laws. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was actually a ray of hope because it actually provided legal teeth to enforce voter rights through federal courts and the Department of Justice. Before the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, in that year, only 7% of eligible Black voters were registered to vote in the state of Mississippi. 7%. 2 years later, 1967, after this thing had been signed and been in process for 2 years, that number had risen to 60% were registered to vote. So the Voting Rights Act of 65 really was a gateway piece of legislation, and because it had the teeth to enforce it. People could call in federal courts to intervene, federal troops sometimes to let people register to vote. Pay particular attention to the Section 5, which had to do with stipulating pre-clearance coverage for states that had a history of voting suppression for people of color. There was a formula for pre-clearance. It was applied to cover the states when their legislators tried to change voting laws. And that simply meant if a southern state, they were mostly southern states, if these states that were problematic and suppressive proposed a voting law change, then it had to go through a pre-clearance formula to see if it would suppress the votes. And it had to do back then with things like taking a literacy test was quite common, and they were absolutely absurd, some of them. In some states, I know it's been done in several books and has been documented, stupid things like how many jelly beans are in the jar. And you have to guess within a range, really, to be able to register to vote. It's absurd. That was only for people of color, however, I'm sure. The pre-clearance formula was applied primarily to and consistently to Alabama, Alaska, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia as overall state entities, the entire states, plus other problematic counties and districts throughout the US. These all had a history of voter suppression, and those other areas were in 6 additional states. Okay, so then we come to that held in place for a long time, and many Republican presidents and Congresses extended it for 10-year increments of time, and had no problem seeing that it needed to remain in place. However, in 2013, the Supreme Court decision, Shelby County versus Holder, pretty much gutted it. And it gutted it on the basis of the pre-clearance formula. It was deemed outdated. Justice Roberts thought it was no longer necessary, that we'd move beyond racial discrimination. But so that's pretty much what they ruled. It was, the formula was outdated, but no replacement has been proposed yet. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act seeks to provide a new pre-clearance coverage formula for current, and the word current is important here, voter suppression efforts, because the current modus operandi of some of these pieces of legislation are quite different. Nobody's asking anybody to guess jelly beans or to recite word for word something like the third paragraph of the US Constitution. So, I mean, those were some of the literacy tests they would give. They were just absolutely absurd. Okay, so they're looking more at current voter suppression efforts. The current efforts to suppress voting rights, we've all been reading about them. I won't go through the litany list. The Brennan Center for Justice has done a great deal of studies on this. The new voting laws have already been signed into law in Georgia and Florida. As of March 24th, 2021, there were 361 bills with restrictive provisions introduced in 47 states. And I have there for Texas, what in the world about Texas? One thing I read about Texas was they actually had, as if you were a Republican, you should have been, you know, humming a happy tune after election 2020, because it had formerly been, there were many purple predictions that, oh, this could go for the Democrats. And, you know, I think Biden in many areas was predicted to go 5%, the winner, 5 points. All of those things did not come to fruition. They won, Texas went overwhelmingly for Trump, and in their local state legislatures and their Senate seats at the federal level, everything went their way. They lucked out, and it came through very Republican, very red. However, in spite of that, they are calling for, in a state that already has pretty strict voting laws, they're trying to make them even stricter yet. So this is a pattern we're seeing. And of course, we all are familiar. I know Debbie is, she lives in she lives in Arizona, but Maricopa County, Arizona is currently having a recount that has no end in sight by a company called Cyber Ninjas that was demanded by 16 of the 30 state senators. Those 16 are the Republicans. There are 14 Democratic state senators. So they are very upset. And so Maricopa County is the densely populous home of 2/3 of Arizona's voters. And so that's why it's so significant in that one county. And President Biden won Arizona by a very slim 10,457 votes. So they want to be sure it's accurate. That's their claim. And there are many other examples in other states. I was reading from Heather Cox Richardson that all of these pieces of legislation are just popping up like whack-a-moles. And there was a leaked video showing Jessica Anderson, who's the executive director of Heritage Action for America, which is the political arm of the Heritage Foundation think tank, explaining to big money donors that Heritage Action has worked closely with Republican state legislators to enact suppression laws. And this is a quote: "In some cases, we actually draft those laws for them, or we have a sentinel on our behalf give them the model legislation." So it has that grassroots, from the bottom up type of vibe to it. So there's been a lot of bragging that from conservative groups that they will help enact and get these pieces of written legislation right up there right away. Now, so John Lewis Voting Rights Act has several key provisions because its job is to provide a new formula to look at pre-clearance of proposed voting law changes. And it looks at the previous 25 years for states that have persistent voting rights violations. And if they find out that they have this pattern, then they are locked into coverage for pre-clearance for a 10-year period that continues to roll forward. So it doesn't become 10-9-8-7-6. It's for 10 years, we're going to look at it. And if you don't make changes, it just moves forward to another 10 years. So things keep moving. So they have to make changes if they want to get out of pre-clearance. The states seeking changes in voting laws have to give a reasonable notice of change in their laws. So transparency is one of the provisions under the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The law is limited. It's not like a litany of hundreds of things they can look at. It's limited to a set of current voting measures. Some of the examples we've all heard, polling sites, both the number of and the location. So when they try to shrink them down to fewer polling sites and or move locations without sufficient notice, so voters don't know, they don't know where they always voted, but it's not here this year. So things like that. Early voting days and the hours open each day having been shrunk. Flexible hours for the drop box availability. There's one state, I can't keep them all straight, but one is proposing that lock boxes or drop boxes not be available after 5 p.m., which is usually when people get off work and think I'll swing by and drop my ballot. Voter roll purges and state rules to request a mail-in ballot. Our state has you never have to give a reason. You just fill out the form and say, I want it. But now they're going to have, in some states, you have to give a reason and make sure it's validated by a doctor, or you're going to be out of town or whatever. So it's really very restrictive. And the John Lewis Act also allows for a federal court to order pre-clearance coverage for results-based violations. And finally, federal observers can be requested through the Attorney General if it gets very restrictive. And it increases accessibility and protections for Native Americans and Alaskan Natives as well. Will it pass? Well, recently, Manchin, from a Democrat from West Virginia, was saying he wasn't interested unless he might consider it if it would apply to all 50 states, as opposed to the ones that are rushing to change their legislation to vote. And that might be a bargaining chip. And actually, in truth, the Supreme Court would probably welcome that change and be more inclined to embrace it and not rule against it. So if it applies to everybody equally, it's not such a bad idea. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the American Jobs Plan of 2021. It was introduced by President Joe Biden on March 31st of 2021, and House Speaker Pelosi would like to see it passed in the House by July 4th of this year, but it's likely going to be late summer or early fall when or if it passes. American Jobs Plan is part one of a two-part package, part two being the American Families Plan, which has not been released yet, but should be coming in the next few weeks. The American Jobs Plan is an omnibus infrastructure bill, and it goes for pages and pages, and it covers roads, bridges, and tunnels, which is the old school definition of infrastructure. But it also looks even farther into modernizing train systems for passenger and freight commerce, broadband accessibility upgraded nationwide. There are many rural areas as well as urban poor centers that are broadband deficient. Clean energy infrastructure and modernizing the electrical grid overall. Education, pre-K through college, childcare for working parents, clean water to American homes. There are many lead pipes still in the infrastructure for delivering water to people. Pass them there, and finally passing a Made in America tax plan to encourage American manufacturers to produce goods and jobs at home and to pay a higher corporate tax rate. And there's much more. So I have it's actually in a table form, a document I found online that just it's called a summary, but it's pages long and it covers just all aspects of it. So it's definitely an omnibus infrastructure bill. The cost, $2 trillion over 8 years. Payment, the president proposes a corporate tax hike over 15 years, plus other modifications to the tax code. When you read those carefully, a cost over 8 years and a payment plan over 15 years, I'd like to get into the weeds of that. I'm sure it's long and detailed. But nonetheless, it's not like saying, on a given date, we're just going to change everything and print money. So, but nonetheless, it has some wonderful plans because as we know, these topics of infrastructure, which I think are real, have been neglected for decades and decades. And it's not a matter of just patching the roads or patching the existing electrical grid. It needs to be have a plan in place for the next generations, plural, of Americans. So will it pass? I'm sure we'll see a lot of arguments coming. It would be nice if, given that it does have so many things that apply to many states, it would be wonderful if some Republicans could come on board, but that might be a pipe dream. And so that brings us to the filibuster and why we need to limit or revoke it. The filibuster requires a Senate supermajority of 60 votes to pass a bill in the Senate. The filibuster is not in the Constitution, but it is part of the Senate rules. The US Constitution gives the Senate the power to pass legislation with a simple majority, which is 50% of the senators, elected senators at that time, plus one. So I put that in there because if we have more or less senators, the same formula applies. Now, the question comes up, does the US Senate represent the majority of American voters? And I found a paper online that was interesting. They had, I think it was from Daily Chaos, and they had gone through a ton of data from the 2020 elections going back to 1992, I believe. And they made it into a table and studied all of the national votes for Senate seats. So it's all Americans voting for a senator. And they looked at it in the presidential elections and the midterms, and then they would take a 4-year term that was bookended by 2 presidential elections in the midterm in between. And so they studied each election as far as votes that went for Democratic candidates or Republican, and then they looked at the composite 4-year with 3 elections in there. And in all cases, it was really amazing. From 1990 to 2020, the national vote totals for the Senate show the GOP won more votes than Democratic candidates only in 1996. And I thought that was amazing. In all of the cases, the national electorate voted for Democratic candidates for the US Senate, but that's just a sum total. However, from 1994 to 2004, and again from 2014 to 2018, the GOP actually won more Senate seats. So they represented a minority of American voters in all those years. And in this last election in 2020, the article cited New Hampshire, that if 10,000 more votes had gone Democratic in that state, we actually might have seen another situation for the next 4 years. Right now, as you know, it's split most of the time, and Kamala Harris is the deciding vote. So finally, the argument has been placed, why don't we just sidestep the filibuster altogether and pass statehood for Washington, D.C. to circumvent it? And that presents an interesting argument. Washington, D.C., the district, was carved out of the state of Maryland, and I don't remember the year, but it's 68 approximate square miles of which 2 are the mall and the government buildings. Very, very few people actually live in, where the government buildings are. They live outside that 2-mile patch of land in the remaining 66 square miles. And the Washington, D.C. has a population of, I looked it up this morning, I think it's about 792,000 people. And so that is a significant number of people. And many of them, of course, work in the district. So getting that passed would help, because it's assumed hypothetically that 2 senators from the state of Washington, D.C. would in fact be Democratic based on their population. And so that's the end of my presentation. We've covered the filibuster. Whether we can ever get any of this stuff passed, I'm not sure. I would suggest it would be a good operation plan to write your senators. Our senators are left-leaning Democrats, and I'm sure they support the principles and positions behind all of these, and just write them and say, I support this. I support the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I support the infrastructure bill, but I don't think it would do one bit of good to write a Republican senator. I don't. Okay. That's it.
Thank you, Bev. That was really detailed. I was wondering, that might be a good thing to write up for our legislation page for the website,
Okay.
so that we have that information there and do updates,
Okay. And
on a regular basis.
I'll also add the citations for the sources for those.
Yeah, that way we could link it, and if people want to look up more information, they can link to it. That would be great.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Janice?
Hello there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. It's a miracle. Actually, going to Washington, D.C., becoming the state, this morning on this George Stephanopoulos' program, they talked about Wyoming, and it has 6,000 people in the state of Wyoming. Now, they have 2 senators, and they're a state. And you just gave a population of 7,000 plus. Washington, D.C. is almost is more populated than Wyoming. They should be a state. Anyway, that to my point. The first thing I'm going to talk about 2 bills, hopefully. For the People Act of 2021 is the first, and that's HR 1 and S1. HR 1 is in the House, S1 is the bill, they're identical, is in the Senate. And given the number 1, that was an indication that the Democrats, the majority party, put this as number 1 priority for their legislation for this session. Truth be told, following Tim, I have to disclose, I have not read the bills. The HR 1 has 885 pages, so feel free to read it yourself if you would like. But summary of this bill addresses voter access, election integrity and security, campaign finance, and ethics for the 3 branches of government. So it covers a lot. For addressing voter access, which is kind of what Beverly had talked about with the John Lewis Voting Act, the bill expands voter registration. That means it's trying to get automatic and same-day registration. Consistent. This is a national bill. This isn't just statewide. This is for the country. And it wants to expand voting access. That is vote by mail and early voting. It also limits removing voters from voter rolls. So you can't just do what some of the states have done, is purge their voting rolls. There have to be criteria. Another thing it tries to do is address election integrity and security. It requires states to establish independent redistricting commissions to carry out congressional redistricting. You know, Illinois is going to lose one representative seat because of our population in this year's current census. So there's going to be redistricting. We don't know who's going to go. This bill sets forth provisions related to election security. It includes sharing intelligence information with state election officials. Our election, Kaczmarek, Jean Kaczmarek, the feds knew that Illinois was hacked, our election system was hacked by the Russians in the 2016 election. But they never told her, or they never told anyone in Illinois, so we could do anything about it. So what they're proposing is including sharing intelligence information with our state officials. If they have information, their election officials need to know what's going on. The provisions are for supporting states in securing their election systems, so helping them better. I mean, our Illinois election equipment is so old. After the next election, I believe it was mentioned the other night that it's going to be outdated. We won't be able to use our election equipment. We need money to be able to pay for this. And I think that was Dawn who was telling me for DuPage County. It proposes to develop a national strategy to protect U.S. democratic institutions. It's going to establish a national commission to protect the United States democratic institutions. And that's going to be in the congressional level. Other provisions are included to improve the cybersecurity of election systems. Most states can't afford getting the cyber geniuses who will help to protect us from the hackers. So federal offensive trying to get those hackers under control and protect our system is needed. It addresses campaign finance by expanding the prohibition on campaign spending by foreign nationals. You can't get a lot of money from foreign governments, so Russia might be a little bit out of funding some of the people in our country who are going for office. It also will require additional disclosures of campaign-related fundraising and spending. Will require additional disclaimers regarding certain political advertising, and establish an alternative campaign funding system for certain federal offices. And to be honest, I can't tell you which offices those are. I can imagine that the president might be involved, the vice president, etc. Addressing ethics is one goal of this bill, and it's addressing ethics for the three branches of government by requiring a code of conduct for the Supreme Court justices. Right now they can do whatever they want. They have their own understood code of conduct. But I think with some of the younger justices that have been put on there, that may have gone by the wayside. It also will prohibit members of the House from serving on the board of for-profit entities. So not just the nonprofit guys, but they can't serve on the for-profit entities. We're going to establish additional conflict of interest and ethic provisions for federal employees and the White House. So conflict of interest, no more putting up Goya beans while you're doing a press conference in the Oval Office. It would address ethics for the three branches of government. Oh, I'm doing that, I'm sorry. The other thing was the bill requires the president and vice president and certain candidates for those offices to disclose 10 years of tax returns. So that would actually be put in, it would be codified that they have to give their tax forms, which it's not now. just on honor. So what's happening with this bill and what are its chances? In the House, and it's only in the House right now, it was introduced in January. I'm sorry, it passed in the House. It passed in the House in March. 220 to 210, which is exactly along party lines. So it did pass in the House on party lines in March. It's in the Senate. And there it was introduced March 14th. And it was just this past Tuesday, it had a hearing in the Rules and Administration Committee. And Amy Klobuchar is the chairperson of that committee. There are a total of 18 members, including Amy Klobuchar. There are 9 Republicans and 8 Democrats and 1 independent, but the independent is Angus King from Maine, and he usually votes Democratic. So basically 9-9, and the result was the committee failed to report favorably because they deadlocked. It was 9-9 split. The last I heard is they are thinking of trying to go directly to the floor with it and skip the fact that the Rules Committee didn't approve it. The Rules Committee is generally considered a gateway committee, and they just sort of look at it and then they do markups, what they want to change, let the people fix it up, the sponsors fix it up, and then send it out again. So I think they're going to skip that. So that is the status of our Poor for the People's Act. I wish it would work. I know that a lot of that stuff, DuPage County could definitely use some money from the government for equipment. The last thing is the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which is in Illinois. And there, the bill is 900 pages long, so I haven't read it, but it creates it basically creates a number of acts and puts some other things forward. The things it creates: Clean Jobs, Workforce and Contract Equity Act, creates the Equity and Empowerment and Clean Energy Advisory Board to administer the Clean Jobs Workforce Hub program. It expands clean energy entrepreneurship and contractor incubator network. It also creates the Returning Residents Clean Jobs Training Program, creates the Illinois Clean Energy Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Primes Contractor Accelerators. So those are building and development for it. It creates the Illinois Clean Energy Jobs Justice Fund. So this gets into funding. Community Energy Climate and Jobs Planning Act, the Energy Community Reinvestment Act, the Clean Energy Empowerment Zone Tax Credit Act, the Coal Severance Fee Act, the Building Energy Performance Standard Act, and the Public Utilities Intervenor Compensation Act. Then it amends a number of things. It amends the Illinois Administrative Procedure Act to follow the emergency rulemaking, to allow for emergency rulemaking. It amends the State Finance Act to create Energy Community Reinvestment Fund, the Illinois Commerce Commission Intervenor Compensation Fund, and the Illinois Clean Energy Jobs Justice Fund. So it created a number of these things, and this is funds to fund those. And it amends the Electric Vehicle Act and the Energy Efficient Building Act, the Illinois Power Agency Act, the Illinois Income Tax Act, the Retailer's Occupation Tax Act, as well as it amends the School Code, the Public Utilities Act, the Environmental Protection Act, that do all these things, the Illinois Power Agency Act, the Retailer's Occupation Tax Act, and the Illinois Income Tax Act, as well as School Code, Public Utilities Act, the Environmental Protection Act, the Illinois Nuclear Facility Act, Safety Act, and Prevailing Wage Act to make changes to implement certain programs. the Illinois Nuclear Facility Safety Act is because they want more clean power from the nuclear reactors that we have. So that's got to be modified. Makes other changes. It would be effective immediately if it's ever passed. The House of Representatives actions there, it's being sponsored by Ann Williams, a Democrat, and it was introduced in February. It has passed the Energy and Environment Committee, and that was March 15th, 18-11, and that was straight across party lines because we had 18 Democrats and 11 Republicans on that committee. It's been referred to the Rules Committee on April 23rd. There are 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans in the Rules Committee. We can kind of think that it'll pass out of the Rules Committee, but there's no hearings scheduled just yet. So we will, and there were witness slips when it was in the Energy and Environment Committee, and there were 1,648 proponents and only 129 opponents to this act. So at the Rules Committee, since there's no hearing scheduled, we can't do witness slips. So that is what I know of those 2 bills. And Bev had something to say. She just slipped something to me before the meeting. And I will give this to Bev. She's had a chance to read it. You're muted, Bev. Bev, you're muted.
I hear you. Okay, I need to share my screen again. I got an email literally at 1:15 or right before we started from Greg Hubert, who is the most knowledgeable person on CEJA and the clean, and its provisions and how it will impact us in Naperville because we are part of a municipal co-op as opposed to a rural co-op, which is different from a public utility like ComEd or Ameren. Most of the CEJA provisions are directed to ComEd and Ameren, and the actual word for word application of CEJA to people in our situation, we get our electricity through Naperville Electric, which is contracts for it through the IMEA, the Illinois Municipal Energy or Electric Agency. And so at any rate, that said, he sent this document. So let's see if I can get it for you. There it is. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just pull it over so it's centered more on my screen so I can read it. There we go. All right. So this mailing has been sent out to people in Naperville. I have not received it yet. I think it's coming from the Naperville Electric Utility. He thinks, he's hypothesizing, and the IMEA together. And this particular printout actually is very anti-CEJA. If you read down, they tout very boldly the solar panel installations we have in Naperville, which actually only produce less than 1%. I think it's less than 0.5% of the electricity we need. But at any rate, it's in defense of fossil fuels. That's the message here. And CEJA goes after fossil fuels. The idea is to close coal-fired power plants in Illinois by 2030. This document from either, I'm assuming it's the Naperville Electric Utility and probably IMEA together, basically want you to know that if you vote for CEJA, we're going to see our utility rates go up tremendously. Now, the rates are going to go up for the electric agency in Naperville Electric, and through IMEA. But guess what? It's going to be trickled down, your bill goes up. And they're predicting it'll go up in some instances as high as 38% and 19% in other ways. Here's a headline in the middle of this document. The 2030 fossil fuel closure should be removed to protect our rates and a reliable electrical grid. I want to address that's BS, which, and we all know BS stands for bad stuff. So what this thing says is if the coal plant in Southern Illinois, Prairie State, which is a major component of our electrical power, were to be shut down, and it would be done with notice, so they would have time to look at the energy markets and procure energy from other sources. So it is very doable. So the word reliable is, it's meant to scare people. It will be reliable. We don't have to worry about that. And the rates from other sources will not go up a huge amount. I mean, it shouldn't, because they're just going to have to repackage the bundle of energy they sell to Naperville Electric. It says we would continue to pay debt service on prematurely closed IMEA-owned assets like Prairie State, and there are some in Kentucky as well, while purchasing replacement energy as early as 2024, because there was some verbiage suggesting even though they're going to shut them down in 2030, we might have to replace it sooner, primarily because the Prairie State Energy Campus, which is that coal-fired power plant, is the single worst carbon producer and emitter in the state of Illinois, and it's the third worst in the nation. So given that, it's amazing. Then it talks about CEJA, and so you can read through this thing. We can post it online if you like, but I think it is a fear piece. It's a document meant to instill fear and have people call their representatives, the state legislature, and just say, please don't support CEJA. And we need to support CEJA because any change from fossil fuel to clean renewables will take time and planning. It won't be cheap, but it has to happen eventually. And it would make for a healthy environment and help us push back on climate change. So they also go on with fees and taxes are going to increase our rate. So there's another warning, you know, Will Robinson, your electric bill's going up. And then net metering disputes and the right to self-generate provisions. I don't think this piece in here is particularly accurate. So, you know, the self-generation provisions, because I think we are restricted in Naperville. If 50% of the homeowners in Illinois in Naperville said, I'm putting solar panels on my roof, we could not do that because by contract with the IMEA through and Naperville Electric, that we cannot do that. We have to get something like 92% of our energy from fossil fuel. And that's what keeps the Prairie State plant going. So this is a scare document that has gone out, and it's kind of interesting. The NEST group, Naperville, Environment and Sustainability
Task
Force. Thank you. I was trying to go through the acronym. Is meeting this evening, but this is not on their agenda tonight. So I will wait to hear more from Greg, but he sent this out because they wanted to have a chance to talk with Janet Yang Rohr. They hope she will continue to support CEJA. So that's it. I will stop. Share. Yeah.
Thank you, Bev, so much. And I know that this meeting has been so wonderfully jam-packed with so much information. Dawn Dessart here, and I would love for you to give me 3 more minutes. I know we're well after 4 o'clock today. Just give me a couple more minutes to let you know about when we were first planning for the programming for ACE for 2021, we decided to include a public service kind of a thing a couple of times a year. Our first one is coming up tomorrow. It starts tomorrow. It's a diaper drive, and it goes from tomorrow through the end of May. And this diaper drive, we have so many great, wonderful organizations in our area, from PADS to Loaves and Fishes. But I had a chance in 2019 to tour the People's Resource Center in Wheaton. And what I love about them is that they have like a grocery store where people in need can go pick up the products and food that they need. But they also have, in their second story, they also have job training classes, job skills classes, resume writing classes, and they have a closet where people can go and pick out their interview clothing and they can have it for free. So I love the whole person kind of concept of the People's Resource Center. And so I called them and I said, what do you need? And they're in need of diapers from infants through adult diapers. So I went online to Amazon and I ordered a bunch of diapers. You'll see, especially they need more larger children's diapers, like the pull-up kinds of diapers through adults. So you won't see that many infant diapers needed. But what you can do, we've created this project under the umbrella of ACE Cares, and you'll see it posted on the ACE Facebook page. I believe it's already on there, but and I know that Karen will be putting it up there daily until this drive is over. But we'd like you to go on the Facebook page, click the link, order some diapers, and those diapers will be mailed directly to the People's Resource Center. So I know we're after 4, well after 4. I just wanted to take a minute of your time and say, please help us with this promotion. Please help buy the diapers needed for the People's Resource Center. Please share it on your Facebook pages and other social media so that we can really help this organization that helps so many people in our area. Thank you for those 3 minutes. Karen, back to you.
Thank you, Dawn. Thanks for spearheading that effort. We really appreciate it. I'm going to wrap up just quick because we've gone over a lot of information. A lot of stuff will be in the newsletter tomorrow. The link for the diaper drive for Amazon will be there. It's also on our Facebook page. And again, that'll run the 17th through the 31st. Hope you can join us for our June meeting. All of that information will be all on social media. You know where it is. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Tim. Awesome job.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you,
you, everyone.
Thanks for having me, guys.
You.
Excellent.
Bye.